When I walked into my dad's house that afternoon, my son wasn't just crying, he was shaking. Not the kind of shaking you see when a kid scrapes his knee or drops his ice cream. This was different. This was the kind of shaking that tells you something inside them just broke. I dropped my bag the second I heard it. I moved fast through the hallway, and the moment I pushed open the living room door, my stomach dropped straight to the floor. Noah was curled up on the couch, both hands pressed over his head, and his hair, what was left of it, was uneven, patchy, shaved down almost to the skin in some spots, like someone had taken a razor to him without caring about the mess they left behind. I rushed over and knelt down in front of him. With both hands cupping his face, I asked him quietly, "Baby, who did this to you?" He lifted his eyes to mine, still trembling, and said in a broken whisper, "Uncle Ryan." Right then, the air in that room went completely still. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard something crack. Not just my heart. Something deeper. At that moment, I didn't know this wasn't just about my son's hair. It was about everything I had ignored for years. Hi everyone. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a pediatric nurse based in Austin, Texas. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago. And I'll be honest with you, I've been going back and forth about whether to share this publicly. But I keep thinking about other parents out there who might be in the same situation I was in, and I know I need to talk about it. So here we are. My job as a nurse means I work with kids every single day. I know what trauma looks like in a child's body. I know how it shows up in their eyes, in the way they hold themselves, in the way they go quiet when they used to be loud. I thought that knowledge made me a good mom. I thought it meant I'd always catch the warning signs in time. I was wrong. About 2 years ago, my marriage ended. It wasn't dramatic. It was just done. And after the divorce, it was just me and Noah. He was 8 at the time. Smart kid, sensitive, the kind of boy who cries at nature documentaries and remembers everybody's birthday. I love that about him, but not everyone in my family did. My dad, George, is old school. Grew up in a different era, different set of rules. He's not a bad man, but he's never been easy to talk to. And my younger brother, Ryan, he's always been the kind of guy who thinks feelings are a weakness and toughness is something you force into people whether they want it or not. Over the years, the relationship between me and my family had gotten complicated. We weren't estranged exactly, but we weren't close either. Still, that weekend, I agreed to bring Noah over to my dad's place. I needed to cover an urgent shift at the hospital and my usual babysitter wasn't available. It seemed like the simplest solution. Noah looked up at me that morning with those big brown eyes, and something in his face told me he didn't want to go. I noticed it. I just didn't listen to it. If I had listened to my son that morning, none of this would have happened. About a month before everything fell apart, Ryan made a joke that should have made me pack up Noah and leave immediately. We were all at my dad's house for a Sunday barbecue. Nothing fancy, just the usual family thing. Noah was sitting off to the side by himself, drawing in that little sketchbook he always carries around. He's always been that kid. Quiet, creative, happiest when he's got a pencil in his hand. And Ryan walked over, looked down at him, and said with a smirk on his face, "You know what your problem is? You draw like a little girl." The second those words came out of his mouth, I felt something tighten in my chest. Noah didn't respond. He just pulled his sketchbook a little closer to his body, like he was shielding it. And that image, my 10-year-old son physically protecting his drawing from his own uncle, should have told me everything I needed to know. But I let it go. I told myself Ryan was just being Ryan. That's what I always did. I minimized it. A few days after that, Ryan called me out of nowhere. His voice was casual, almost cheerful, when he said to me, "Hey, I've been thinking. You're raising that boy too soft. Let me spend some time with him. I'll toughen him up." Right away, a cold feeling crept up the back of my neck. I pushed it down. Instead of saying what I actually wanted to say, I kept my voice even and told him, "He's fine, Ryan. He doesn't need to be toughened up. He's 10. But Ryan wasn't hearing it. He shot back without missing a beat. That's exactly the problem. You're babying him. The world's not gonna baby him. I ended the call shortly after that. I remember sitting there for a moment, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. But then, my next shift started. Noah needed help with homework, and life moved on the way it always does. I buried the feeling under a pile of things to do. What I didn't know was that Ryan hadn't dropped it. Not even close. Over the following weeks, every time we were around family, he'd find little ways to chip away at Noah. If Noah didn't want to go outside and play, Ryan would shake his head like it was something shameful. One afternoon, Noah tripped on the porch steps and started to tear up, the way any kid would. Before I could even move, Ryan leaned down and said to him with that same flat tone, "Don't cry. Boys don't do that." Noah blinked hard, swallowed it down, and went quiet. And I stood right there and didn't say nearly enough. I said, "Ryan, come on," and then changed the subject. That's it. That's all I did. Looking back now, I can see so clearly what was happening. Ryan wasn't just making off-color jokes. He was testing boundaries. He was watching to see how far he could push before someone stopped him. And every single time I brushed it off, every time I told myself it wasn't a big deal, I was giving him the answer he was looking for. Noah started dragging his feet on the weekends we visited. He'd get quiet on the drive over. He'd find reasons to stay close to me instead of going off to play. Once, about 2 weeks before the incident, he tugged on my sleeve and whispered to me, "Mom, I don't like it when Uncle Ryan talks to me." I pulled him close, kissed the top of his head, and told him gently, "I know, baby. Just ignore him. He doesn't mean anything by it." I genuinely believed that. I thought Ryan was just rough around the edges. I thought it was generational, harmless, something Noah would shake off. I thought I was being rational. I wasn't. I was just being comfortable. And comfort, sometimes, is the most dangerous thing in the world. I thought it was just talk, until the day he finally acted on it. That morning started like any other Saturday. I was up before Noah, coffee in hand, scrolling through my phone when the call came in. It was my charge nurse. Her voice was tight when she said to me, "Emily, I'm sorry to do this to you on a weekend, but we've got a situation here. 2 nurses called out sick and the floor is slammed. I need you in by 9. I looked at the clock. It was already past 7. I closed my eyes for a second and said, "Okay, give me an hour." I hung up and just stood there in my kitchen for a moment, thinking. On a normal day, this wouldn't have been a problem. My neighbor Karen watched Noah plenty of times when something came up last minute. But when I texted her that morning, she replied almost immediately, "So sorry, Em. We're already out of town this weekend. Hope you find someone." I went through my mental list fast. Every name I landed on had a reason it wouldn't work. Too far. Already busy. Hadn't spoken in months. And the clock kept moving. That's when my phone buzzed again. It was my dad. He was checking in about nothing in particular, just one of his usual short texts. And right there, standing in my kitchen in my scrubs, I made the decision. I called him back and asked without overthinking it, "Hey, any chance you can watch Noah today? Just for a few hours." I got called in. There was a brief pause, and then my dad said in that steady, unbothered way of his, "Sure, bring him over." It should have felt like relief. And for about 30 seconds, it did. Then Noah walked into the kitchen, still half asleep, hair messy, sketchbook already tucked under his arm. When I told him the plan, something shifted in his face. It wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't whining. It was quieter than that, and somehow, that made it worse. He looked straight at me and said in a small, careful voice, "Mom, I don't want to go." Right then, my chest tightened. I crouched down so I was at his level and looked him in the eye. Gently, I told him, "I know, bud, but I have to go to work. Grandpa's going to be there. It's just for a few hours." He didn't argue. He just looked at me with those eyes, the ones that always see right through me, and asked quietly, "Is Uncle Ryan gonna be there?" And I hesitated. Just for a second. But I hesitated. I didn't know for certain whether Ryan was going to stop by, but I told myself probably not. It was a Saturday morning. Ryan had his own life. I smoothed Noah's hair back and told him as steadily as I could, "I'm not sure, bud, but even if he is, it's just a few hours. You'll be fine." He didn't say anything after that. He just nodded slowly and went to get his shoes. That nod broke my heart a little, even then. There was something resigned about it, something too grown-up for a 10-year-old. But I was already running late and my brain was already halfway to the hospital. I got his bag together, made sure he had his sketchbook and his snacks, and loaded us into the car. The drive to my dad's house took about 20 minutes. Noah sat in the back, quiet the whole way. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that fills up all the space in a car and makes it hard to breathe. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Ryan's truck parked out front. Something moved through me when I saw it. Fast and cold, like a warning. I almost said something. I almost turned the car back around. Instead, I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself Noah was going to be fine. I walked him to the door, hugged him tight, and said to him as warmly as I could manage, "I'll be back before dinner. I love you so much." He hugged me back and didn't let go right away. I was the one who stepped back first. I kissed his forehead and walked out the door, not knowing that I was walking straight into the worst mistake of my life. I got the call 3 hours into my shift. It was my dad's number, and the moment I saw it on my screen, that cold feeling from the morning came rushing back. I stepped out of the hallway and picked up. Before I could even say hello, I heard Noah in the background. Not talking. Not calling for me. Just this low, broken sound that I can only describe as a child who has completely run out of fight. I told my charge nurse I had a family emergency and I was out the door in under 2 minutes. The whole drive back, my hands were tight on the wheel and my mind was cycling through every possible scenario. I kept telling myself it was something small. A fall, an argument, something fixable. But that sound in the background wouldn't leave me alone. When I got to my dad's house and found Noah the way I described at the start of this, curled up on that couch with his hands pressed over his head, I knew immediately it wasn't small. After I got him calmed down enough to breathe, after I held him and rocked him and told him over and over that I was there, I asked him to tell me what happened. His voice, when he finally spoke, wasn't angry. It was terrified. And the story he told me came out slowly, in pieces, the way trauma always does. He said that about an hour after I left, Ryan showed up in the living room where Noah was sitting and drawing. Ryan looked at him for a moment and then said in a casual, almost friendly tone, "Hey, come on. Let's get you cleaned up a little. I'm just gonna give you a trim." Noah told me he didn't want to. He said he told Ryan clearly, "No, I don't want a haircut." But Ryan didn't move. He just smiled and said, "It's not a big deal. It'll take 5 minutes. Come on, be a man about it." That phrase, "be a man about it." Noah said it like he'd memorized it, like it had burned itself into his memory the moment it was said. He told me he still said no. He stayed in his seat and shook his head. And that's when Ryan stopped asking. He put his hand on Noah's shoulder, firmly, and steered him toward the bathroom down the hall. Noah said he tried to pull away. He said he told him again, "I don't want to. Stop." But Ryan kept moving, kept talking over him, kept saying things like it was nothing, like it was normal, like Noah was being ridiculous for resisting. By the time they were in the bathroom, Ryan had already plugged in the clippers. Noah told me he saw them, and something in his stomach dropped. He said he turned around and tried to walk back out. And that's when Ryan grabbed him by both shoulders and sat him down hard on the edge of the tub. Noah said, "I told him no again, Mom." I said no, and I was crying, and he still did it. When those words came out of his mouth, something inside me snapped, clean in half. He said Ryan turned him so he was facing away from the mirror, facing the wall, so he couldn't see what was happening, and then the clippers turned on. Noah said he was shaking and crying and saying no the whole time. He said he tried to stand up once, and Ryan put a hand on top of his head and held him in place. Just held him there. Like it was nothing. Like my son saying no meant absolutely nothing. By the time it was over, Noah said he ran straight to the living room and didn't move. He didn't go to my dad. He didn't say anything to anyone. He just sat there with his hands over his head, shaking, waiting for me to come back. When he finished telling me all of that, the room felt like it had no air left in it. I sat there holding him, and I could feel his whole body still trembling slightly under my hands. I looked at what Ryan had done. It wasn't a trim. It wasn't even close to a trim. It was a statement. The kind a bully makes when they want to show someone who's in control. Patchy in some places, shaved almost to nothing in others. Like the whole point wasn't the haircut at all. The whole point was the power. And my father, who had been in that house the entire time, had let it happen. That thought hit me second, right after the grief. My dad was home. He heard Noah crying. And he did nothing. I held Noah tighter and pressed my lips to the top of his head, what was left of his hair rough against my mouth. I told him as steadily as I could, even though my voice was barely holding together. You did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing. You said no, and that mattered. It always matters. He nodded against my shoulder, and I sat there for another moment, breathing through it, trying to hold myself together for him. But underneath that, something was rising in me that I hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't just anger. It was the kind of clarity that only comes when someone crosses a line so far that there's no more room for patience, for excuses, or for keeping the peace. I stood up slowly. I set Noah gently back against the cushions, and I walked toward the hallway where I could hear Ryan's voice, completely unbothered, talking to my dad like nothing had happened. And when he said I told him no, something inside me snapped. I walked into that kitchen with every intention of staying calm. I told myself on the way down that hallway to keep it together, to be measured, to say what needed to be said without losing control. I almost managed it. Ryan was leaning against the counter with a glass of water in his hand, completely relaxed, mid-sentence about something I didn't catch. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table. Neither of them looked up right away when I walked in. I stopped in the middle of the room, and with my voice as level as I could keep it, I looked straight at Ryan and said, "What the hell did you do to my son?" The kitchen went quiet. Ryan set his glass down slowly and looked at me with an expression that I still think about to this day, because it wasn't guilt. It wasn't even surprise. It was mild irritation, like I was the one being unreasonable. He crossed his arms and said flatly, "I gave him a haircut. Relax." Right then, heat rushed up the back of my neck. I took one step closer and said, keeping my voice tight and controlled, "He was crying. He told you no. He said no multiple times, and you held him down." Ryan let out a short exhale through his nose, the kind of sound someone makes when they think they're dealing with someone hysterical, and he said, "He was being dramatic. Kid needed to toughen up. I did him a favor." The word favor landed like a slap. Before I could respond, my dad shifted in his chair and said in that slow, tired voice he uses when he wants to shut something down, "Emily, it's just a haircut. You're blowing this way out of proportion." And just like that, the last bit of calm I was holding onto started slipping. I turned to my dad and said, "He held Noah down, Dad." Noah was crying and saying no, and Ryan physically held him down. That's not a haircut. That's assault. My dad's jaw tightened. He looked away from me and said, "That's a strong word for something this minor." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I turned back to Ryan and said, "He's 10 years old. You don't get to decide what happens to his body." He said no. That means no. It doesn't matter if it's a haircut or anything else. No means no. Ryan looked at me for a long moment and then said with a slow, deliberate calm that was somehow worse than if he'd yelled, "You're raising a boy who can't handle anything. You're turning him into someone who's gonna get eaten alive out there." I was trying to help him. Something broke open in me when he said that. Not composure, not yet, but something deeper. Because I realized in that moment that Ryan genuinely believed what he was saying. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't performing. He truly did not see what he had done as wrong, and that was more terrifying to me than anything else. I moved closer to him and said with every word measured and deliberate, "What you taught him today is that when he says no, it doesn't matter. That someone bigger than him can just override it. That's what you put in my son's head today. You proud of that?" Ryan's expression flickered. Just for a second. Then he reset and said, "You're being insane." From behind me, my dad's voice came again, firmer this time. "Emily, that's enough. You need to calm down." I spun around to face him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't soften what I was about to say. I looked at my father and said clearly, "You were here. The whole time. You were in this house. And you heard him crying and you did nothing." The silence that followed that sentence was different from the others. It had weight to it. My dad looked at me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, almost defensively, "Boys need to learn to handle things." I laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind that comes out when something is so far beyond what you can process that your body doesn't know what else to do. And then I said, "He's 10, Dad. He's a child. And you both just taught him that the people who are supposed to protect him won't." Ryan pushed off the counter and said with an edge creeping into his voice now, "You know what your problem is? You've been so busy trying to be his friend that you forgot how to be his parent." That was the sentence that crossed the line. Not just for me emotionally, but in some deeper way that I can't fully explain even now. Because it wasn't just wrong. It was constructed specifically to hurt me. It was designed to take everything I was saying about Noah and flip it back onto me, to make me the problem, to make my son's pain my failure. I stood there looking at Ryan, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not hot rage, something colder and more absolute than that. A door closing. A decision being made somewhere below conscious thought. And right then, I realized I wasn't arguing with family anymore. I was arguing with someone who had hurt my child, who felt no remorse, who was backed up by a father who'd rather keep the peace than tell the truth. And the woman who would have swallowed that and driven home was already gone. I want to be honest with you about what happened next. Because this is the part of the story where I stop being the clear-cut victim and become something more complicated. And I think you deserve the full truth, not just the version that makes me look good. After Ryan said what he said, I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. I didn't do any of the things you might expect from someone who had just hit their breaking point. Instead, I walked out of the kitchen without another word. Ryan and my dad probably thought I was leaving. I could hear my dad let out a long breath behind me, the kind that says finally, "She's done." But I wasn't done. I walked back to the living room, where Noah was still curled up on the couch. I knelt down in front of him and looked at him carefully. His eyes were red and swollen. There was still that slight tremor in his hands. And on the side table next to him, I noticed Ryan had left the clippers sitting there. Just sitting there, out in the open, like a tool after a job well done. I picked them up. I stood there for a moment holding them, feeling the weight of them in my hand. And something settled over me. I won't call it a plan because it wasn't planned. I won't call it rational because it wasn't rational. It was something older than logic. Something that kicked in at the base level where all the careful, measured, professional parts of me had gone completely silent. I walked back down that hallway. When I pushed open the kitchen door, Ryan looked up and saw me standing there with the clippers in my hand. For the first time since I'd arrived, something shifted in his face. He started to say, "What are you?" But I crossed the room before he finished the sentence. I was on him fast, faster than either of us expected, and I grabbed a fistful of his hair at the back of his head the same way he'd grabbed Noah, the same pressure, the same lack of asking. Ryan's whole body went rigid. Through his teeth, with genuine shock in his voice, he said, hey, what are you doing? Let go." And I said, low and steady, right next to his ear, "No, just that one word. The same word my son said 3 times and was ignored. I turned the clippers on. Ryan lurched forward and grabbed my wrist hard. The clippers made contact with the side of his head for just a second before he wrenched himself away, knocking back against the counter. My dad was on his feet, knocking his chair back, his voice rising sharply. "Emily, what is wrong with you?" Ryan had both hands pressed to the side of his head. His breathing was coming hard and fast. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, fear. Real, unfiltered fear. And I stood there with the clippers still running in my hand, and I said to him, completely calm, "That's what it felt like." For 30 seconds, that's what it felt like. He lived through it for 20 minutes. The clippers hummed in the silence. Then Ryan's voice came back, and it was shaking now, different from before. "You're crazy. You're actually crazy." He pushed past me toward the living room. My dad followed him, his hand on Ryan's arm, already in damage control mode. I turned the clippers off. I set them back on the counter. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Everything in my body felt strangely still, the way it sometimes does after something irreversible happens. I could hear Ryan in the other room, his voice climbing, saying he was going to call the police, saying I had attacked him, saying I needed help. My dad's voice underneath his, lower, trying to manage the situation the way he always managed situations, by making them smaller than they were. And right then I heard a sound from the hallway. Small, barely there. I turned around and Noah was standing in the kitchen doorway in his socks, eyes wide, taking in the whole scene. The look on his face when he saw me stopped me cold. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was confusion and something close to fear, and seeing that on my son's face after everything that had already happened to him that day was the thing that finally cracked me open all the way. I went to him immediately, turned him gently back toward the living room, and said to him quietly, "Go sit back down, baby. I'm here. It's okay." He didn't move right away. He looked up at me and asked in barely a whisper, "Mom, are you okay?" The question hit me somewhere I didn't expect. I took a slow breath and told him as evenly as I could, "I'm okay. I just need you to go sit down for me, all right?" He went. And I stood there in that hallway for a moment, alone, and let the reality of what I had just done land on me fully. I didn't regret it. Not in that moment. Maybe that says something about me. Maybe it says something about what it feels like to watch your child get hurt, and then be told by the people who were supposed to protect him that it was fine, that it was a favor, that he needed it. I walked to the front door and opened it to get some air. That's when I saw the neighbor across the street standing in her driveway, completely still, staring at the house. She had her phone in her hand. And within 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. That's when someone called the police. When the police arrived, everything stopped. Except the truth. 2 officers came through the front door within minutes of each other. One was older, heavyset, with the kind of face that seemed too much to be surprised by anything. The other was younger, a woman, and she was the one who spotted Noah first. She moved toward him slowly, carefully, the way you approach a kid who's already been through something, and she crouched down to his level and said to him gently, "Hey there. What's your name?" Noah looked at her for a second and then said quietly, "Noah." She smiled at him and said, "That's a great name. Are you okay?" He shook his head, just once, small and honest. And something about that single head shake, that one small no from a 10-year-old who had already said no too many times that day and been ignored, made my throat close completely. The older officer had Ryan off to one side of the room. Ryan was talking fast, animated, his hand gesturing to the side of his head where the clippers had made contact. It was barely anything, a rough patch, maybe an inch wide, nothing close to what he'd done to Noah. But he was presenting it like evidence of a crime, which I understood even then was exactly what it was. My dad was standing near the hallway, arms crossed, already playing the role of witness for Ryan's version of events. He told the officer in a firm, controlled voice, "She came in here and attacked her brother with clippers. Unprovoked. Out of nowhere. I looked at my dad when he said that. Unprovoked. I looked at him for a long moment and didn't say anything. The younger officer came to me next. She asked me to walk her through what happened from the beginning. And I did. I told her everything. I told her about leaving Noah that morning, about Ryan's history of comments, about what Noah had described to me when I came back. She listened without interrupting. She took notes. When I finished, she looked at me steadily and said, "I need to ask you directly. Did you grab your brother and use the clippers on him?" I looked back at her and said, "Yes, I did." She nodded, wrote something down, and then said, "Okay, I appreciate you being straight with me." What happened over the next hour surprised me, because the officers didn't just take Ryan's statement and call it a day. The younger officer went back to Noah. She sat with him on the couch, just the two of them, while I waited across the room. She spoke to him quietly for a long time. I couldn't hear everything, but I could see him talking, slowly at first, then more. At one point, he pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, and she didn't rush him. She just stayed right there with him and let him go at his own pace. What Noah told her matched everything he'd told me, every detail. The clippers being plugged in, being turned toward the wall, saying no, being held down, crying the entire time. When she came back across the room, she had a different look on her face than when she'd started. Tighter, more deliberate. She said something quietly to her partner that I couldn't catch, and then things shifted. A third car arrived. Child Protective Services. A woman in a gray blazer came in, introduced herself, and immediately requested a separate space to speak with Noah alone. My dad started to object. He said in a sharp voice, "This is getting completely out of hand." It was a haircut. The older officer turned to him and said with a flat, no-argument tone, "Sir, a minor reported being physically restrained against his will. We're required to follow protocol. Please let us do our job." My dad went quiet. Ryan's lawyer was apparently already on the phone because Ryan spent a stretch of time outside on the porch with his back to us, speaking in a low, urgent voice. When the CPS worker came back out, she asked to speak with me privately in the kitchen. She sat across from me, at the same table where my dad had been sitting an hour earlier, and said carefully, "Your son's account is consistent and detailed. What he's describing, being physically restrained and having something done to his body after repeatedly saying no, meets the criteria we take seriously." She paused and then said, "I also need to be transparent with you. Given what you did in response, we'll need to assess the full situation. That includes you." I nodded. I told her I understood. She looked at me for a moment and then said, not unkindly, "You're a pediatric nurse. You know what consent means for a child. You know what this kind of experience can do." I said, "I know. That's why I reacted the way I did." She didn't respond to that directly, but she wrote something down, and I noticed her expression didn't change in the way I expected it to. About 20 minutes later, Ryan was placed in handcuffs. He looked genuinely stunned, like the concept of consequence had never fully applied to him before, and was only now, at this specific moment, becoming real. As they walked him past me toward the door, he turned his head and said with a hard, disbelieving edge in his voice, "You did this. You know that? You blew up this entire family." I held his gaze and said nothing. My dad followed them to the door, already on his phone, already in motion. He didn't look at me on the way out. The house went quiet. I went back to Noah, sat down beside him, and pulled him close. He leaned into me without a word. And outside, through the window, I could see the red and blue lights still rotating slowly in the early evening light. But the real battle wasn't over. It was just beginning in court. 2 months later, I sat in a courtroom and waited to find out if protecting my son made me a criminal. That's not a dramatization. That's exactly what it felt like. Because the reality of the legal situation was this. Ryan had been charged with assault and unlawful restraint of a minor, and I had been charged with misdemeanor assault for what I did with those clippers. We were both defendants. In different cases, yes, but in the same building, in the same system, answering for what happened in that kitchen. My attorney was a woman named Patricia, sharp and direct, the kind of lawyer who doesn't waste words. When she first sat down with me and laid out the full picture, she looked at me evenly and said, "Here's where we are. What Ryan did to Noah is clear-cut. The restraint, the documented distress, your son's consistent testimony, the CPS findings, it builds a strong case. Your situation is more nuanced." I asked her, "How nuanced?" She folded her hands on the table and said, "You used physical force on another adult without legal authorization to do so. The fact that you were emotionally provoked and acting out of parental distress is relevant but not automatically a legal defense. We're going to argue defense of others, but I want you to understand that's not a guarantee." I sat with that for a moment and then told her, "Whatever happens to me, I need Ryan to be held accountable for what he did to Noah." She looked at me and said simply, "Then let's make sure Noah's voice is the loudest thing in that room." And it was. Noah testified. I hadn't wanted him to. Every instinct I had as his mother told me to shield him from it, to keep him off that stand, to let the adults sort it out without putting any more weight on his 10-year-old shoulders. But Patricia said to me during our prep, "His testimony is the case. The jury needs to hear it from him. And honestly, I think he can handle it. He's been through worse already." She was right. He could handle it. When Noah sat in that witness box, he was small and still and serious in a way that made the whole room go quiet. The prosecutor walked him through it gently, step by step, and Noah answered every single question with the same calm, careful honesty he'd given the officer that first night. He didn't perform. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth in his own words, and that was more than enough. At one point the prosecutor asked him, "Noah, did you tell your uncle you didn't want a haircut?" Noah looked straight ahead and said clearly, "Yes." I said no 3 times. The prosecutor asked, "And what happened when you said no?" Noah was quiet for just a second, and then said, "He did it anyway." There was no sound in that courtroom after those 4 words. Just stillness. Ryan's defense attorney tried hard. He argued that Ryan's intentions were not malicious, that there was no lasting physical harm, that the situation had been blown out of proportion by an emotionally reactive parent. He painted Ryan as a well-meaning uncle from a different generation, who simply had a different idea of how to raise boys. It was a competent argument, it just couldn't survive Noah's 4 words. On Ryan's case, the jury deliberated for less than a day. They came back with guilty on the unlawful restraint charge and guilty on the assault charge. Ryan stood very still when the verdict was read. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm. My dad, who was sitting 3 rows behind Ryan, closed his eyes. Ryan was sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and was ordered to have no contact with Noah for a period of 3 years. It wasn't prison. Part of me had wanted prison, if I'm being completely honest with you. But Patricia had told me early on not to expect that, for a first offense with no prior record. What mattered, she said, was the record itself, the conviction, the fact that what Ryan did was named for what it was. On my case, the judge reviewed the full context, including the CPS findings, Noah's testimony, and the documented history of Ryan's behavior toward my son. My attorney argued defense of others and emotional duress. The judge looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. The kind of look that takes you apart a little bit, and then she said in a measured, careful tone, "Miss Carter, what you experienced that day as a mother is something this court does not dismiss. And the record makes clear that your son was failed by multiple adults in that house before you arrived." She paused and then continued, "That said, taking the law into your own hands is not something this court can simply overlook. However, given the totality of the circumstances, I am dismissing the charge with a formal warning and a requirement of 12 sessions of anger management counseling." She looked at me directly one more time and said, "Do not let this happen again." I said, Yes, Your Honor. And that was it. Ryan walked out with a conviction and a probation officer. I walked out with a warning and a court date for counseling. My dad walked out without saying a word to either of us. We didn't speak in the parking lot. We didn't hug. There was no moment of family coming back together in the relief of it being over. We just moved toward our separate cars like strangers who happened to be parked in the same lot. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine. I thought about Noah at home with the babysitter, probably drawing in his sketchbook, probably not thinking about any of this. I thought about Ryan's face when the verdict was read. I thought about my dad closing his eyes. Justice was served. But it didn't feel like a victory. 1 year has passed since that day, and my life is quieter now, but heavier in ways I didn't expect. Noah is doing better. Not perfect. Not the way I wish he could just be completely fine and untouched by all of it, but genuinely better. He's back to drawing in his sketchbook. He laughs at dumb jokes again. He started a little art club at school with 2 of his friends, which is the most Noah thing I've ever heard, and it makes my heart full every single time I think about it. He sees a therapist every other week, a kind man named Dr. Reeves who Noah actually likes, which I consider a miracle in itself. Some days Noah talks about what happened. Some days he doesn't. I follow his lead. I don't push. I've learned that the most important thing I can do for him is let him move through it at his own pace. And to make sure he knows, every single day, that his no matters. That it always will. As for my family, I haven't spoken to my dad or Ryan since the courthouse parking lot. Ryan is completing his probation. My dad, as far as I know, still thinks I overreacted. I stopped waiting for him to understand. That was its own kind of grief. Letting go of the hope that the people who raised you will eventually see you clearly. It took me a long time to stop feeling guilty about cutting contact. Some days I still do. But then I look at Noah, and I remember what it cost him to be in that house. And the guilt gets a little quieter. I made mistakes in this story. I ignored the warning signs. I left my son somewhere I knew in my gut wasn't safe. I responded to violence with violence. I'm not proud of all of it, but I'm not going to pretend I'd do everything differently, because the truth is I don't know. What I do know is this: your child's no is sacred. Their boundaries are not inconveniences. And keeping the peace in your family is never, ever worth your child's sense of safety. Never. So I'll leave you with the question I've asked myself 100 times since that day. If you had walked into that house and found your child the way I found Noah, knowing everything you now know about what happened inside those walls, what would you have done? Would you have kept your composure? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the family peace and protecting your child, share your story, because you might be the reason someone else finally finds the courage to choose their kid. Thanks for listening.